Beneath the ancient floors of Windsor Castle lies a vault so secret only two people had access, the late Queen Elizabeth and her most trusted advisor. But just days ago, that seal was broken not by accident, but by a sovereign's command. What King Charles found was not treasure, but something far more dangerous, a single handwritten letter addressed to him about Prince Harry. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The sealed vault, cloaked in royal mystery, has existed since the reign of Queen Victoria. It's a room untouched by time, shrouded in silence, where sovereigns have stored their most personal truths never meant for the public, and often not even for their heirs. Queen Elizabeth, known for her ironclad privacy and meticulous documentation, maintained a hidden archive there, each letter handwritten, each page sealed with wax. No scans, no backups, no modern trace. Only ink, parchment, and intention. For years, no one dared disturb the chamber, not even after her passing. But now, that silence has been broken. Mounting tensions within the Crown's inner circle had been bubbling beneath the surface, conflicting reports, strategic meetings, and whispered concerns about the monarchy's legacy. Charles, burdened with decisions his mother once bore alone, was being pressured to either mend the fractured royal image or draw a line in the sand. Desperate for guidance, he finally gave the order to unseal the vault. What awaited him was not strategy or policy, but a message only a mother could write, a letter hidden in plain sight, marked with 7 fateful words, to be opened only by the king. As the heavy vault doors creaked open, dust-filled air escaped into the corridor like a breath long held. The shelves were lined with documents, some dating back nearly a century, but it was one item, lying atop an ornately carved wooden box, that drew Charles's gaze. The letter's envelope was thick, slightly yellowed, and bearing the royal insignia in wax. His hands trembled as he reached for it. No aides were present, no guards nearby. It was just the king, the words of a queen and a legacy about to be challenged. He didn't speak, didn't blink. According to a senior footman who waited just beyond the threshold, Charles stood frozen for nearly 10 minutes, staring at the sealed letter, as if unsure whether to open it or let its contents remain buried with its author. And then, with deliberate solemnity, he took it with him, alone, into his private quarters. Whatever was written in that letter, it was clear from the king's pallor and silence afterward it wasn't merely a note, it was a revelation. But what did the Queen feel so compelled to write in secrecy, guarded even from the royal archives? The contents of the letter would rattle the monarchy to its core. She never said it publicly, she never hinted it in speeches, but inside that sealed envelope were the Queen's unfiltered thoughts, raw, heartbreaking, and brutally honest about the grandson she once adored. What she revealed stunned King Charles into silence. The letter, though royal in its seal, bore none of the formal language usually reserved for state affairs. It was unmistakably a grandmother's voice, warm yet wounded, precise yet painfully personal. In page after page, Queen Elizabeth reflected on Harry's early years, calling him "my spark in the shadow of duty." She recounted his laughter as a boy, his irreverent charm, and how she once believed he would bring a fresh, modern soul to the ancient monarchy. But then came the fracture. The words that followed carried the sting of disappointment, but also the weight of self-blame. The Queen admitted she saw the change coming slowly, then all at once, and felt powerless to stop it. She wrote of the moment Harry and Meghan announced their departure, and how the silence that followed cut deeper than the public uproar. The Oprah interview was described as a breaking of the family covenant, something she never anticipated from her grandson. But her words weren't cruel. They were marked by grief. She confessed she feared Harry no longer recognized himself, that he had been swept away by a life that demanded rejection of all he came from. "There is a difference between choosing love," she wrote, "and abandoning legacy." Then came the most gut-wrenching admission, her fear that Harry was being isolated, not just physically but emotionally. The Queen named no names, but she hinted at a force that had drawn him away from the family's compass. "He no longer looks toward the North Star," she wrote, "but instead listens to echoes that twist love into suspicion." She described a grandson who once thrived in royal chaos, now looking hollow-eyed from behind closed Californian gates. She feared that trust once the invisible string holding the family together had snapped, and there was no telling what might unravel next. Yet even in heartbreak, the Queen did not condemn. She urged Charles to tread with caution. "Do not act in anger," she wrote. "Do not mistake silence for defiance." She reminded him that leadership, especially of family, required restraint, that legacy wasn't only about lineage, but about mercy. Her final plea was simple yet profound: hold the door open, even if he doesn't walk through it right away. But as Charles reread the words, one line in particular stopped him cold and revealed a shadowy figure the Queen feared even more than public scandal. The Queen's letter didn't just reflect sorrow, it issued a warning. "Beware the one whispering in his ear," she wrote. Those chilling words sent palace aides scrambling to uncover who she meant, and what they found raised disturbing questions about influence, control, and betrayal within the royal family. For King Charles, that one line eclipsed every tear-stained sentence before it. It wasn't just concern, it was a targeted alert from a monarch known for her precision. The Queen had always chosen her words with surgical care, and this was no poetic flourish. It was a coded alarm. Charles, gripped by a rising sense of unease, summoned his closest advisers under the cloak of night, demanding an explanation that no one could provide. The phrase, "the one whispering in his ear," echoed through the palace halls like a ghost. Whispers soon turned into theories. Was it a royal aide still embedded within the system, a political figure from across the Atlantic, or worse, someone from within the family itself, whose influence had slowly poisoned Harry's relationship with the crown? Confidential reports surfaced that suggested Queen Elizabeth had already begun her own quiet inquiry in the final year of her life. Through trusted Commonwealth contacts and discreet envoys, she had collected fragments, comments made at private events, unusual leaks to the press, sudden shifts in Harry's tone and alignment. One aide whispered that Her Majesty received a classified folder weeks before her death, naming individuals suspected of manipulating not only Harry's public messaging, but his private beliefs. The contents of that folder remain locked, but insiders claim it changed how the Queen saw everything and everyone. What disturbed Charles most was a single sentence buried deep in the letter, nearly lost in the margins. The stories did not begin with the papers. They began in the palace. This revelation shattered any illusion that the chaos had only come from the outside. Someone close, someone trusted had been feeding the narrative. Leaks weren't just media strategy gone rogue. They were tactical, intentional. Betrayal had been growing within the walls of Windsor, and Charles could no longer ignore the growing rot. In response, the king allegedly called for a private briefing with former intelligence officers linked to MI5. It wasn't just about loyalty anymore. It was about national security. If the monarchy's own members or staff were being manipulated, then the entire institution stood vulnerable. One advisor, speaking anonymously, claimed Charles became obsessed. He reread the Queen's letter daily, each time circling the same phrase, "the one whispering." Every meeting from that point forward was filtered through that fear. Every aide evaluated. Every silence questioned. But as the king turned to his own counsel for answers, he uncovered something even more haunting: a second document hidden deeper within the vault. Behind the Queen's letter lay another sealed document marked for monarch's eyes only. Inside was a confidential annex detailing something few knew existed: Operation Mirror, a royal contingency plan in case a senior royal defected from the family completely. And yes, it was about Harry. King Charles had barely recovered from the emotional weight of the Queen's letter when his eyes caught sight of a second envelope, thicker, more official, and stamped with a classification reserved for state crises, not family matters. As he carefully unfolded the document, it became clear this wasn't written in his mother's hand, but rather prepared under her direct instruction. Titled Operation Mirror, the protocol revealed the monarchy's most covert internal safeguard, crafted during the height of the Megxit fallout. It was chilling, not only in its detail, but in its implication. The Crown had prepared for the possibility that Harry could become a defector, not just emotionally or geographically, but ideologically. The annex laid out multiple levels of defense. The first focused on monitoring public sentiment and mapping shifts in global opinion regarding the monarchy versus the Sussexes. Metrics of sympathy, trust, and credibility were tracked not by the palace's PR team, but by an outsourced intelligence network embedded within Commonwealth media outlets. The second level was darker legal contingencies, discussions with constitutional advisors, and private dialogues with the Church of England about the moral line of departure. That phrase appeared repeatedly, suggesting the monarchy had quietly asked itself a previously unthinkable question: what happens when blood alone is no longer enough? The most explosive part came buried in the document's fourth page, the clause titled Lineal Renunciation. It outlined procedures to symbolically and legally detach a royal from the line of succession, not through stripping titles, but by orchestrating a formal disassociation approved by both church and state. Though no name was explicitly mentioned, every paragraph made it obvious this clause was built for Harry. The Queen had anticipated that his separation might go beyond a sabbatical and might evolve into a public campaign against the very system he was born into. And if it did, the monarchy had a quiet, devastating weapon to protect itself. But even that wasn't the end. Operation Mirror included media protocols and protective measures in the event of damaging publications, memoirs, interviews, documentaries that could destabilize the institution. It authorized the launch of sympathetic narratives, the declassification of certain royal records, and the strategic re-elevation of other family members to dilute public focus. It wasn't just a plan, it was a battlefield strategy, built in silence, in case the House of Windsor ever had to go to war with one of its own. For Charles, reading this was like opening a wound within a wound. His mother hadn't simply feared for Harry's departure, she had forecasted the possibility of Harry becoming the Crown's greatest liability. And worse, she'd prepared accordingly, without once telling her son. It was in that moment that Charles saw it clearly. His mother had never fully trusted reconciliation. She had quietly accepted the possibility of total fracture. And now, he had to ask himself, was this her final defense of the monarchy? Or her final confession that even she had failed to hold the family together? But as Charles digested the severity of what he'd found, an even deeper cut emerged: his mother's unspoken comparison between him and his own son. Buried in the Queen's emotional letter was not just a warning, but a plea. A line that act Charles's composure. You must be the father I could not be. For a man who spent decades in his mother's shadow, those words carried both judgment and redemption. In that single sentence, Queen Elizabeth pierced a wound Charles had long tried to bury beneath duty, protocol, and silence. It was not just about Harry, it was about him. The Queen, in her final moments of clarity and reflection, had looked backward before looking forward. She admitted in subtle but unmistakable terms that she had failed her own son during the darkest period of his life, the death of Diana. In the pages that followed, she confessed that in choosing monarchy over motherhood, she had created ripples that never truly faded. Charles, she wrote, had been left to grieve in public with no compass, no comfort, and no shield. And now history was repeating this time, with his son caught in the same lonely storm. She wrote of the monarchy's unforgiving coldness toward emotional expression, how the system she once defended demanded that feelings be buried beneath function and wounds be wrapped in silence. She called it a tradition that secures the crown, but shatters the spirit. Her message was not just reflective, it was confrontational. She pointed out how Harry's cries for help were not sudden, but years in the making, and that many of them fell upon ancient ears, too proud or too afraid to hear what was truly being said. It was a stark admission from a sovereign who had defined stoicism, now aiding for change she would never live to see. Among the pages, she included a list short but devastating. Milestones missed, moments lost, birthdays passed over, phone calls unanswered. She described them not as accusations but as evidence of slow decay. Each entry was a quiet indictment of choices made, chances avoided, and love withheld. For Charles, it wasn't just a reminder, it was a reckoning. According to palace insiders, the king broke down upon reading it. Not in front of staff, not in court, but in the privacy of his chambers with Camilla by his side. In tears, he is said to have whispered, She knew everything I feared, admitting that the distance between him and Harry had grown too vast, too thorned, too bitter to cross, yet now he held the one map that might lead him back. But it came with responsibility. The Queen wasn't asking Charles to be a king in this matter. She was asking him to be a father first, a father who listens, a father who protects, a father who forgives, and above all, a father who breaks the cycle. The cost of redemption, however, was steep. It meant confronting the palace machinery, upsetting the heir's judgment, and risking further scandal. Yet the question was no longer whether Charles would respond, it was how. But redemption, if possible, would come at a cost, and Charles now faced a terrible decision that no monarch should ever be forced to make. 3 cars, no press, no staff, just Charles, William, and a single envelope. At Balmoral Castle, where the Queen once spent her final summer, a secret summit took place, one that would decide the fate of Prince Harry's future connection to the crown. The stillness of the Highland estate concealed the turbulence within its walls. Charles had summoned his son, not just as the Prince of Wales, but as the future king, the one who would ultimately inherit the consequences of every decision made today. The Queen's letter and the explosive annex had shaken the current monarch to his core, but it was time for the heir to face the storm as well. William arrived tense, guarded, already wary. But nothing prepared him for what his father was about to place before him. The handwritten letter from the Queen to Harry, and the existence of Operation Mirror. At first, William refused to believe what he was hearing. A covert contingency plan? A surveillance operation? His face darkened as Charles recited the Queen's haunting phrase, "Beware the one whispering in his ear." William's response was immediate and visceral. He saw it not as an opportunity to fix the past, but a brutal confirmation that the Queen herself had grown afraid of Harry's direction. "He chose this," William snapped. He turned his back. "And now we're left to clean up the wreckage." The room, once sacred with royal tradition, trembled under the weight of legacy and anger. When Charles revealed the full scope of the Queen's writing, her pleas for empathy, her regrets, her instructions, William's fury erupted. He slammed his palm against the table, shouting that reopening this door would divide the family permanently. But Charles remained composed, steely, resolute, and yet torn. "We can't ignore what she asked of us," he said. "Not when it came from her heart, not her crown." It wasn't just a debate over one man, it was a reckoning over the values of the institution itself. Tradition versus reconciliation. Preservation versus evolution. Eventually, a fragile compromise emerged. Harry would be contacted but not welcomed unconditionally. The crown would extend a path, not a pardon. If there was to be a conversation, it would happen on royal terms, within royal boundaries. The Queen's letter would not be kept in a vault, it would be delivered. And the man tasked with that delivery? William himself. Reluctantly, he took the envelope from Charles's hand. He didn't speak. His eyes, once full of certainty, now flickered with unease. As he turned to leave, the burden of history hung heavy on his shoulders. The letter was not just paper and ink, it was the last breath of a monarch, and it now rested in the hands of a future king. But as the wheels of diplomacy turned behind the scenes, someone unexpected found out about the vault, and they were determined to leak everything. Just as Charles began considering reconciliation, the media exploded. Headlines screamed of a secret Queen's letter and shadow operations on Harry. The vault had been breached, but not by a monarch. There was a mole inside the palace, and their betrayal would shift everything. The news broke like thunder. Royal correspondents who once towed the line of discretion now boldly declared a royal security breach. Tabloid front pages blared phrases like "Queen's final warning," and Charles knew all along. It was too precise, too intimate, and far too dangerous to have come from mere speculation. Someone had leaked portions of the Queen's private letter passages that had only ever been seen by 2 men, the King and his son. Charles's blood ran cold. The walls he had trusted for decades were no longer silent. Someone inside the palace had spoken, and now the crown was bleeding from within. The royal household immediately initiated a discreet but urgent lockdown of internal access. Security officials narrowed the suspect list to just 4 individuals, all with authorized clearance to the lower archive level. These weren't new hires or interns. These were legacy staff, some of whom had served the Queen for decades. And yet, even loyalty forged over a lifetime could be eroded by secrets, promises, or agendas. What made matters worse were the access logs. The night before Charles entered the vault, a curious pattern emerged. Someone had entered the hallway, bypassed camera zones, and left no electronic signature. Hours later, the surveillance footage from the corridor was found corrupted. For a palace that prides itself on precision, this was no accident. This was a ghost with insider knowledge. Then came the most damning detail: a longtime staff member, a quiet figure with no history of scandal, vanished without explanation. Her quarters were found untouched, her phone disconnected. She was rumored to have once served as a personal secretary to a senior royal now living abroad, and whispers in the palace linked her to private correspondence channels that had long since been shut down. The timing was impossible to ignore, and the damage already spiraling. One paper quoted the Queen's phrase nearly word for word, "You must be the father I could not be." The public, now drawn into what was supposed to be a private reckoning, began choosing sides. The Crown's internal dilemma was becoming a global drama. In desperation, Charles authorized internal interrogations to be conducted in total secrecy. Not even William was notified at first. Trusted aides were pulled into rooms without warning. Backgrounds were rechecked, communications traced. The paranoia spread like wildfire. Who had accessed the vault? Who else knew of Operation Mirror? And most haunting of all was this: a leak meant to sabotage reconciliation, or force it. The palace, once a fortress of order, now pulsed with mistrust. Even Charles began to look over his shoulder, questioning the loyalty of those who had stood beside him for decades. The betrayal wasn't just a leak, it was a fracture in the very soul of the monarchy. The Queen had warned of someone whispering, but now the whisper had become a scream. And while the palace crumbled under suspicion, a figure emerged in California, unaware of the storm brewing in Britain and the letter that now had his name. Across the ocean, Prince Harry sat down alone with a letter. Not from his father, but from the grandmother he thought he'd lost forever. And when he read her final words, everything he thought he knew about loyalty, family, and legacy shattered. The envelope was delivered quietly, no fanfare, no warnings. A royal emissary arrived in Montecito, requesting a private audience with Harry alone. Meghan, sources say, as not informed of the letter's existence beforehand. It was a calculated decision, one made by the Crown to preserve the intimacy of what was to be shared. The emissary placed the letter in Harry's hands, then left without a word. For a long moment he just stared at it, the seal, the script, the realization that this might be the last thing his grandmother ever wanted him to see. As he read her handwriting, so familiar, so precise, something shifted in him. The Queen's voice, once distant and institutional, now felt heartbreakingly human. She spoke not as the monarch, but as his grandmother. She wrote of love that never vanished, only grew silent, of regret that clung to her final days, of how she had watched him drift away, praying he'd one day find his way back, the pain of his departure, the headlines, the interview. None of it had erased the boy she remembered, a boy who made her laugh when the world felt cold, a boy she believed still lived beneath the anger and hurt. When he reached the final page, he whispered 5 words that would echo far beyond California. I never knew she still cared. It was the sentence that broke him, not because of its warmth, but because of what it exposed. For all his defiance, all his declarations of independence, he had never truly stopped wondering whether she had given up on him. Now, in her absence, he had his answer, and with it came something unexpected, a spark not of rebellion but of reconciliation. The Queen's final words offered no demands, no conditions, only hope. No door, she wrote, is ever truly shut for those with Windsor blood. That sentence carried the weight of centuries. It wasn't just permission, it was an invitation, a chance to return, not in title or duty, but in heart. Harry sat with the letter for hours, silent, still, wrestling with truths that peeled away years of bitterness. And then, quietly, he reached for his phone. The call was made not through aides or assistants, but directly, a private number, a single ring. and on the other end, his father's voice. It was the beginning of something that neither of them could yet define, but both knew they had to face. But if Harry wanted to step toward healing, he would have to face one last trial and the ghosts of decisions that still haunted the palace. At the stroke of midnight, Charles made the call. Harry would be welcomed, but under one unbreakable condition: a public reckoning, a symbolic act to restore what was lost. And with the world watching, Harry would have to decide loyalty to his past or to the crown's future. The decision did not come easily. It was not a sweeping pardon or a silent gesture of forgiveness. Charles, though moved by the Queen's final words and Harry's unexpected phone call, knew the wounds went deeper than any single conversation. The monarchy had been shaken by departure, by distance, by betrayal, and its restoration required more than sentiment. So the terms were drawn, sharp and resolute. Harry could not simply return. He would not reclaim his titles, nor his former stature, until he made a formal royal pledge on. He spoken aloud before the Commonwealth, swearing loyalty not just to family, but to the institution he once walked away from. And yet, alongside the terms came an offer. A seat at the Commonwealth Council, symbolic, yes, but powerful. A role that would place Harry at the table where global influence was shaped, where legacy met diplomacy. It was a bridge between two worlds, a path to redemption that did not erase his past, but gave him a purpose within the future. But with that bridge came tension. Meghan, sources revealed, was deeply unsettled, not by the offer itself, but by what it demanded: public surrender, private compromise. An oath that would anchor Harry once again to the very system they had fled to escape. Behind palace walls, William remained guarded. But the ice had started to crack. Private calls between the brothers, once unthinkable, began to unfold. They were not warm, nor easy, but they were honest. William admitted fear. Harry admitted hurt. They did not speak as princes, but as sons. And in the silence between their sentences lay the ghost of their mother, their shared grief, their divided loyalty, and the aching possibility that they might yet find common ground. Charles gave a deadline: 1 month. No press, no public statement. Time for Harry to consider the Queen's words, the crown's offer, and the reality that stood before him. The palace, for once, stood still, waiting not with judgment, but with guarded hope. And in Montecito, Harry sat alone once again. The Queen's letter open on his desk, the same words circling his mind: "No door is ever truly shut for those with Windsor blood." But as he stared at the crest in the corner of the page, the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavier than ever. One step forward could reclaim the past, or it could end it forever. And so, as the monarchy stands at a dangerous crossroads, the Queen's last letter may become the key to either rebuilding the House of Windsor or watching it fall from within. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.